I'm going to do a deeper dive into a specific instance of intersectionality and to look at the opportunities that shrinking the carceral state creates for environmental justice and climate justice. And in particular, I'm going to talk about Rikers Island in New York City. Rikers Island is ancestral Rockaway land, and it was allocated, the island itself was allocated by Dutch Governor Peter Stuyvesant to the von Ryken family. And this background is sort of important, I think, because the same dynamic that was going on in the 1600s in New York City is the dynamic that we're grappling with today. The von Rykens were slaveholders. They used enslaved labor and exploited it to make a fortune that they then parlayed into political and social influence. The member of the family that I particularly want to talk to you about is the man on the left. That's Recorder Riker. To white New York, he was a good, kind-hearted judge. If you read, they wrote poems about him. He was the recorder of the city, which is a municipal judge. To the African-American part of New York City, he was the spider at the web of injustice. The man in the bottom in the center, that's David Ruggles. This is sort of an interesting aside. This is apparently the first political cartoon that appeared in a paper of an African-American that was an actual drawing of a person rather than a caricature. David Ruggles was a prominent abolitionist, and he was a member of the Committee for Vigilance, and he spent most of his youth fighting Recorder Riker, trying to prevent the kidnapping club from kidnapping free New Yorkers and selling them into slavery in the South. That's Rikers Island's history. In 1932, Rikers Island became the main prison for New York City. This is Rikers Island. It was a freaking disaster from the beginning. If you read accounts in the New York Times from the 1930s, the island originally was 89 acres. Unpaid prison labor increased it to 413 acres using the trash from Manhattan. The island off-gases methane. It's a toxic place by every metrics that a place could be toxic. The people who were incarcerated on Rikers Island were black and brown people, and still are black and brown people, almost exclusively. 5 neighborhoods, the ones on the right-hand side, contribute most of the people who are detained at Rikers Island. They are all predominantly African-American communities, and they will figure in the story later on. Melissa Mark Veveritos, who was the Speaker of City Council, called it a stain on human dignity and decency. Headlines: Rikers violence out of control. This, by the way, is the violence of the guards on the inmates. Mass incarceration stains everything and everyone it touches. This is Jonathan Littman, who was the former chief judge of New York Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in New York. He headed a commission about what to do about Rikers Island. America's worst 10 prisons, Rikers Island, Rolling Stone expose. Rikers Island is Lord of the Flies for youth. Preet Bharara wrote a report after the tragic but unfortunately quite predictable suicide of Khalid Browder, who was incarcerated as a pretrial detainee, never convicted of anything, accused of theft of a backpack, spent 3 years on Rikers Island, 2 of them in solitary confinement, waiting for his speedy trial. When he was released, he was so traumatized by the experience that he wound up taking his own life. His suicide galvanized New York to see what was happening. So there's a very strong movement led mostly by formerly incarcerated people, the Close Rikers movement. And it set an audacious goal, not let's make Rikers a better place, which, would be a reasonable, perhaps, goal, but shut Rikers. This is a stain on the city. It cannot exist. It must end. And there's an advantage to setting audacious goals. Because if you don't ask, if you don't demand, you will never get. You might not get anyway, but for sure, if you're not demanding it, you're never going to have it. And the amazing thing is that the Close Rikers movement really has been remarkably successful. It brought together a broad coalition of the city, the white New York and black New York and brown New York. People organized around what was actually happening in Rikers Island. Naomi Klein talks about, in the context of climate change, how we see it and then we look away because it's so overwhelming. This was a moment where New York saw what was happening. And it also was a political moment where change could happen, and change is happening. So this is a picture of New York's Mayor Bill de Blasio the day that he signed the bill that City Council passed to close Rikers Island. And by city law, Rikers Island must close by 2026. New York at the same time outlawed cash bail for most people. New York State did that. These things were happening at the same time, though. There's a fruitful synergy. And that is super important because almost all of the people who were incarcerated on Rikers Island over time, just like Khalid Browder, were pretrial detainees. 80% of the people who are on Rikers Island are pretrial detainees. Turns out, if we're not detaining them pretrial, we don't need that big a jail. So shutting Rikers has, there's all kinds of stuff about that. But what I want to talk about is the climate justice and environmental justice moment that this opportunity creates. Because the Littman Commission, which wrote a report called A More Just New York, calling for Rikers Island to be shut, had a paragraph on a page, about 100 of 110 report, saying maybe the island could be used for some sustainability something. Or it could be a runway for LaGuardia, but maybe it could be something sustainable. And a bunch of environmental activists and environmental policymakers took that paragraph and ran with it and came up with the Renewable Rikers proposal that I'm going to talk about to you today, which is an attempt to create some kind of restorative justice for the communities that were most impacted by Rikers Island, and will also have the effect of benefiting the rest of New York. So Renewable Rikers. I wanted to start by showing this part, by showing you a map of where power is consumed in New York City. No great surprise, right? Most of the power is, red means more, by the way, right? That's Manhattan on the left, that's Queens on the right, that's Rikers Island, right there. So this is where power is consumed in New York City. My students have this great project. We're going around the city, just stopping people saying, hey, do you know where New York City gets its power from? And the answer is generally the switch on the wall. But this is where New York City's power is generated. Do you remember that big red swath that was Manhattan? That's not where the power is generated. This is where the power is generated. This is where the power is generated. This is where the power is generated. This in particular, this is Astoria in Queens. This is the South Bronx. This is Harlem. These are among the neighborhoods that were most impacted by incarceration on Rikers Island. So too, this is Williamsburg, another area that was seriously impacted. This is East New York, right? The neighborhoods that were most impacted by incarceration are also the neighborhoods that bear the biggest burden in terms of where power is generated in New York City. This is EJ's screen. These are the number of people who live near Rikers Island. You notice they are all overwhelmingly minority neighborhoods. This is the map that gets me the angriest, because this is what happened while I was living in New York in 2000. Those yellow bars are all peaker power plants that were forced onto communities of color in New York City in 2000 against their will, with no consultation and no environmental assessment, particularly no environmental assessment of the impacts of PM 2.5, even though the Supreme Court was at that time considering Whitman versus American Trucking. And the idea for Renewable Rikers is to rectify this injustice as well as to rectify this injustice. This is another map of where the wastewater treatment plants are in New York City. You may notice, again, Manhattan, not so much. South Bronx, Harlem, Astoria, right? East New York, Williamsburg. The same neighborhoods that were most impacted by incarceration on Rikers also were the neighborhoods that were host to this locally undesirable land use that has tremendous, like the power plants, has tremendous implications for pollution, which leads us to this map, which is childhood asthma hospitalizations. One of the strongest indicators in New York for people who are at risk of incarceration is days missed of school. Guess what one of the primary reasons people miss days of school in New York City is? Asthma. I could show you map after map of different health outcomes in these communities. The point I just want to show you is that there's a connection between the communities that were most impacted by incarceration on Rikers. Obviously, over-policing, stop and frisk, mass incarceration decimated those communities. But there's an environmental connection as well. These are communities that are exposed to far more particulate matter, far more of all kinds of pollutants that harm health and keep kids out of school and set them on a track that is not going to be a productive one for them. Out of this recognition of these dual tracks, Renewable Rikers was born. The idea is, once Rikers Island is no longer being used to incarcerate people, use it for sustainable energy generation and wastewater treatment. Move those facilities, not just add here, but move the facilities out of those communities that are most impacted by incarceration on Rikers. Give them a form of restorative environmental justice by transforming their neighborhoods, improving the air quality, improving the conditions on the ground for people that will improve their health and give kids a better trajectory in terms of their ability to attend schools. February 2020, City Council held a hearing about Renewable Rikers, 3 bills, one of which would be a feasibility study about the possibility of moving the wastewater treatment plants from these super affected neighborhoods to Rikers Island. Another one about moving the peaker plants out of those communities and replacing it with solar, wind, and battery storage on Rikers. And just to emphasize the climate connection, this is New York City's flood maps. These are all the power plants. Blue is flood zone, surge zone. The mayor just declared that the city was going to be 100% renewable energy by 2050. I'm all for that. We'll see if it happens. I have a personal stake in this. Not only do I live in New York City, this is the view from my window. I have a child. I care a lot about this. But this is a moment of opportunity to transform, a moment of intersectional advocacy, to combine the decarceration movement with the environmental justice movement and the climate justice movement and make things better for everybody. Thank you.